Hi, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me, and James checking that you can hear me as well. Great. Thank you so much to Heather and to James for those really interesting keynote sessions. I know that several people have questions. There will be time to take questions, but for now, I have a couple of questions for my panel. And I'll have a chat with them for a few minutes, and then I'll open it up for the audience to ask questions. We also have someone who will be monitoring the online community, and if you have any questions for James, for Heather, Tuukka, myself, or Delfina, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we will come to you. So my first question is actually for Heather and James. I'll start with you, Heather. I'd like to find out, you've both just eloquently discussed your engagements with intelligent non-human beings and the modern human world. So the question is, how might we change in relation to it? Was this always a core part of your thought and your creative work? If it wasn't, what led you to this realm or interest? Was there a particular aha moment that proved pivotal to the shift?
Is that working? Yes, it is. Okay, many questions. Which order? Have I always been that way? I do remember as a child being quite fascinated by ants and just wondering, where are they going? What are they doing? How are they so busy? And they seem so purposeful. So I do remember, just being absolutely fascinated by the complexity of all that stuff going on. But I think the slime mold is the organism I've worked with mostly. I've been working with it on and off for over 15 years. And prior to that, I had worked with living biological materials. I'd cultured skin organisms. I'd worked with botanical plants, and that was really interesting, working with the properties of other living things. That's the palette with which I work, the behaviors and mechanisms. But it was quite intellectual, I think, initially, when I first encountered the slime mold, and I was really interested in all the human curiosity that it sparked. The more I discovered, all these humans wanting to ask questions of this organism that's completely oblivious to our existence. It's just getting on with doing this thing in the forest. And I found that fascinating. And I think the changing is a gradual thing. I think the more I have got to know it and worked with it, the interest, that intellectual interest still remains, but it has, as James ended his talk with as well, it's about being changed by the things that we're working with. And so that's not an aha moment, that's a whole kind of iterative process of mini aha moments ongoing.
Thank you. I'd like to pass it on to you now, James.
Yeah, I mean, I can really only echo what Heather just said. I spoke a little bit in my talk about sort of some of my route into these ways of thinking, and there was sort of aha moments when you feel a certain sort of connection that you hadn't been aware of before, and those can come in little flashes, or they can come in time, and they come in multiple different ways. They come intellectually in the head when you study and think about these things, and they come in embodied ways through the relation of your body, through making stuff or working with your hands. These are all different ways of gaining awareness and connection with the world, and they're all equally valid. And like as Aldous Huxley said, nothing short of everything will really do. The best is to try all of them. I do think it matters that for these kind of practices that you will not be getting the full thing, as I said, unless you are receptive consciously to the world around you. I was talking to a friend the other day who does ecotherapy. He's an ecotherapist, which is a form of kind of psychoanalysis, but it's really more like a kind of guided meditation. He essentially takes people out into the forest and encourages them to spend time in direct connection with the more than human world. And he was telling me that he's done that with a few scientists, people who've studied the natural world as something remote, as something outside themselves, outside of their worlds, for their entire careers, and yet had never sat in a forest for half an hour and listened to the trees. And that is a profound experience that sounds so simple and so obvious, and yet so few of us actually practice. And it's practicable in all kinds of ways, and it can be done in cities and elsewhere. But it is, I think, the most important realization to have if one wishes to be engaged in this kind of work.
Thank you. Tuukka, I'd like to come to you now. Why does the more than human perspective matter for the perspective of regenerative design and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's a great question. And somehow we, as the organizing team of Becoming Regenerative, we obviously believe that it matters greatly, because we decided to kind of choose this as the theme for today. So I am very biased, but I personally believe that it does matter hugely. If I just try to give an answer in a nutshell, one great danger is that regeneration will just become a form of greenwashing, and it has partly become greenwashing already. And there can be other sort of versions of regeneration that do not entail transformation, not the kind of transformation that James and Heather have been discussing at the very least. So for me, it's very instructive and important to root some of this research in this paradigm, rich thought around and perception around more than human worlds, because that's a different way to be. It's a very different relationship. That's exactly what James was talking about. So it's important for us to see whether that's present there as these design projects and enterprises emerge. And then also equally, it's important to see whether this orientation to the world will persist as these startups proceed further and further, in some ways, into this capitalistic system that we have. And, you know, it will be easy to say that they will probably die, languish, and you know, they'll be co-opted and corrupted and all that. But we don't actually think so. We think that there will be some forms in which this paradigm will, through entrepreneurship, as Onya kind of, as you said, Onya, about sort of transformative potential entrepreneurship, we think that this ethos may be brought into the economy partly through this entrepreneurial work. So it matters at so many different levels, and I've really been stimulated by today's talks to think more about it.
I agree, and it links very nicely with what James ended with at the end of his talk, where he said you actually change. Because if you're changed, if your consciousness, if the way that you're thinking is changed, when you're exposed to that capitalist system, you don't have to make some split-second decision. You already know what your conviction is. So I agree.
Yeah. And then also your way of thinking and feeling and perceiving may have shifted. That's great. But can you express that through your startup in the fashion sector, in architecture, in other fields? Can you express it? How do you express it? What does growth mean, for instance? Maybe there's a more biological notion of growth, and how will that be received? So yes, we're very interested in this question.
Great. Delfina, you're a biologist. Why do you think this project is important, and what brought you to it? And what is the value of art and design in all of this?
That's a really good question. And there are many, many facets that resonate with my own journey. I studied biology 5 years, and back in the time, it was not like a specialized degree. I had to go through from genetics to molecules to ecology. But actually, I finished my degree specializing in neuroscience. So there are two elements that I took from that are the very different domains and the interrelations, and also an interest in ecology, but also an interest in contesting intelligences, as neurons was one of my biggest fascinations. So in that way, I after came to the RCA And I moved from having a scientific mindset method to arriving to an art and design context in which imagination and the possibility of rethink things was very, very different. There were a lot of methodological options and availabilities. I did my PhD here at the Royal College of Art, and I was actually able to combine various things that would have not been possible in our disciplines. And also I wrote my whole PhD, which is called The Idiot, as a critique to Silicon Valley's mentality about intelligence based on optimization and efficiency in first person. So through my own journey, I have seen what's really interesting about science. I've experienced what's the limitation of it and the problems of specialization. I've admired here in the RCA, by being surrounded by so many impressive art and designers, the possibilities of the imagination and the value of rethinking paradigms and contesting things, and the fact that we're super exposed to so many different practitioners. So I think I've managed to understand values of many different fields. And in the context of the climate emergency, regeneration became such an interesting moment for all of us in bringing ecological imagination into our practices. But for me, it doesn't stop in just the imagination. It's about how you change your worldview, and also how do you actually start doing things differently. So I have a huge belief that by providing this kind of ground in which there is this very expansive moment of rethinking things and rethinking paradigms, but also in combination to also understanding how living system works. That's something that is extremely fascinating about science, and actually being very aware of which are the impacts that can lead to providing health back into the planet that desperately needs that, makes me feel that this project can really create an interesting ground and can foster also possibilities for art and design to become more engaged with this. And ultimately, thinking about impact, I think if through the project we understand also which are the complexities, what are limitations, and also through the journeys of these entrepreneurs that we're going to thoroughly analyze, in this case with empirical and design research, mixed methods, this might allow in the future to help them to thrive better. So yeah, it provides me hope that if understood, and also if then all of our outcomes are then understood by either governments or by universities, this can allow many of these projects to flourish and have a big impact.
Thank you. James, I'd like to come back to you. And I'd like to focus on the questions about technology and the incessant, relentless sort of societal and economic focus on AI that we seem to be going through at the moment, with billions of pounds being invested in LLMs, large language models, owned by a handful of technology giants. In such a world, is there any chance that we might be able to expand our understanding of intelligence to genuinely include biological and ecological intelligences, and the kinds of intelligences that exist in between things rather than in the things themselves, a sort of pluralistic, relational, and creative notion of intelligence? What pathways might exist to pursuing such an alternative world of intelligences?
Well, I think one of the first things is to have a very clear understanding of what's happening with the current kind of wave of AI hype, which is that it's essentially a business practice. It has nothing to do really with intelligence. It's about the search for certain products that will make money and accrue power to certain organizations and people. That's what's happening there. And it has really very little at all to do with broader questions of intelligence, or what intelligence might be. But I still find it extraordinary that that we're so easily sort of tricked into obsessing with it. And I do attribute that to our utter fascination with the possibilities of non-human intelligence, on the some kind of base level recognition that even if what gets called artificial intelligence in the present moment is very far from a meaningful intelligence in that sense. It's just statistics. But our kind of innate desire to meet this other kind of intelligence, whatever it might be, it speaks to the lack of that awareness, I think, in our general everyday lives, in our societies and culture, where we have been educated, trained, accultured into thinking of ourselves as the only real intelligences around. So artificial intelligence provides this extraordinary moment in which fundamentally undermines that fallacy, that kind of permits us to think for a moment about what it would be like to meet other intelligences. And for some of us, that moment is a moment when our vision widens, when we start to realize that, oh, if intelligence can be all of these different things, then actually intelligence is going on all around us all the time. We have to hold on to the realization that that is being actively worked against all the time by our culture, by our society, by capitalism, by the formulation of these kinds of AI discourses that we're subjected to all the time. But it doesn't mean that they're not achievable to us. I don't think the way AI is discussed and formulated at the moment is pushing anyone towards a greater ecological consciousness. But there's many things happening in the world, thankfully, and not all of them are entrained to that. There's all kinds of currents and rising awarenesses of ideas like regeneration that go beyond, the stuck position of sustainability, the idea that we'll just carry on as we are, the idea that we must actually transform ourselves as part of our transformation of the world, and that we're going somewhere beyond what we have known before. When those ideas start to sink in, I think there's a greater receptivity at large to new kinds of relations with the rest of the world, and anything that kind of pushes us towards that realization is part of that path.
Thank you. Heather, how important is it to develop the sort of modern human consciousness or approach you've described today when engaging in design, innovation, and indeed entrepreneurship at this moment in time? What are the most serious obstacles here when we think beyond the relatively privileged art and design school space?
Can I come on to the educational aspects? I'd like to pick up on the artificial intelligence. And I think one of the big kind of blind spots with the hype of artificial intelligence is the recognition that the intelligences that we are creating are disembodied. The intelligences that we've described, that James, in terms of the relationship between the plants and the insects, me talking about the slime mold being in constant dialogue with its environment. These intelligences are embodied, they are situated, they are interacting with other forms of intelligence in an ecosystem of intelligences, which is, the unbuilt, every organism has its own kind of sensory sensibility. And it's those interrelationships of intelligences which arrives at true intelligence. And I think until artificial intelligence can be embodied and interacting in kind of interrelationships, then it is, as James says, just statistics. It's a very kind of dumb tool. The question about education, I think this is really important. So I teach at Central St Martin's on an interdisciplinary programme, MA Art and Science, and I co-direct the Living Systems Lab Research Group, which has researchers and PhD students working with living systems in different ways. And so I do a lot of work that is about kind of nature-based learning, learning from the land, from the environment. And increasingly, we have students who have, for example, never sat on the grass. So an example, like James was talking about, the scientists who've never actually sat in the woods for any length of time. So this disconnection is a reality, and we live in a very techno-scientific world. Time and pace of kind of, particularly in urban environments, we don't take time to stop and to notice and to, to be with. And it is that is the transformative element of actually stepping off the rapid roller coaster. So I think, I don't know if this answers your question, but talking about being in a privileged position of an art story is really thinking about taking time rather than, all our economic and political systems are short term. If we really want to be regenerative and to persist as a species on this planet, as only one of 8.7 million species on this planet, and probably millions more that haven't been discovered or named yet, we do need to kind of break the patterns and the pace and the habits. And I think we have a responsibility in higher education, in all forms of education, to create space and time for deeper ecological attunement, understanding. If we're educating the artists, designers, architects, entrepreneurs of the future, they need to have an understanding of materials, processes, systems, and how those systems are working, and not in any superficial way. And I think part of that process is immersion and really creating the opportunity to notice, observe, understand. Sorry, I went off on one.
Okay, thank you. Great answer. I'm going to throw this question at the panelists. So any one of the four of you can choose to answer this question. Can you tell us more of how you see the future field of design and ethics when it comes to working with more than human species? Well, Heather, this might speak to you more, especially the lesser ones. So if any one of the panel would like to take this one.
Just briefly clarify that obviously the lesser in my title is a provocation. And I think we really need to challenge those hierarchies. Human exceptionalism is the problem, quite a fundamental problem. So yes, flatten the hierarchies.
Delfina, are you going to?
Yes, I remember talking to you, Heather, in this planning for this event, and something that really struck me was a little dialogue in which you said that for many of these lesser organisms, there's no ethics forms that you need to fill. So maybe if you can expand on that in your experience as an artist, as an academic.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge topic of personhood, subjecthood, ethical frameworks. And if we just take scientific research, model organisms are organisms that are well understood and well studied, and they're kind of standardized organisms that are replicated and used in many areas of research. So they're real building blocks to knowledge. But many model organisms are also popular for very practical reasons. So slime molds, in most countries, ants, you don't need to go through a long ethical process of working as you would with other animal models. So there is a very kind of clear, and then there are different kind of graduations of ethical approval required. So that affects the research that is done, and you just think of the kind of domino effect of those status and hierarchies. Is quite profound. And there's lots of really interesting work going on legally around it. I think just recently a river was granted personhood and legal rights. So there's a lot within kind of land and kind of natural phenomena. There's been work around apes and personhood. So there's sort of legal definitions are blurring, but there's a long way to go. I mean, I don't think we're going to be in a situation where slime mold is granted personhood just yet.
Thank you, Heather. Tuukka, did you want to add?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question. And of course, there is this emerging field of more than human ethics and philosophy, which is very relevant here. But also, if you look at this from a different angle and kind of riffing on what James said, there's also organizations, the world of organizations, and the kind of ethics of the organization. And I happen to have just a little bit of experience with looking at how organizations approach ethics, and surprise, surprise, modern human ethics are not even part of the discussion. There's a little bit on sustainability, of course, increasingly. So the question arises, how do we bring the organization into the modern human world? Can we? And how do we realign these things, right? So that's a massive, massive question. It relates to everything that Heather said, I believe. But yeah, a lot more work has to be done there. Can organizations be truly part of modern human world? I mean, they're already more sort of other than human themselves.
Could I share an anecdote?
Yes.
So in response to that, so that one of my students is working with fungi. So her work relates mycophobia to queerphobia. She's looking at the mushroom as a queer species. I won't go into all of that interesting stuff. But her ethical approval, she's working with participants, human participants. The ethical approval in her institution only refers to human participants and not non-human. But she wrote into her ethical approval process the entire ethics of all the species that she was working with. Whether that will change and create, next time we're on the template, we'll have a little, are you working with other non-human participants? And what are the ethical considerations there? But it's kind of, subverting the system slightly. So maybe that can become amplified in time.
Thank you. Did you want to make a point, Delfina?
Just a quick comment, but I think if we have a growing field of more than human design practices, then the universe, going back to the organizations, we also have to change in terms of our ethical forms, as Heather super spotted. And for that, we need to bring some teams to design those forms and rethink them. So I think it's also a really interesting, transdisciplinary moment to rethink which are these ethical approvals. If art and design institutions will play a key role, then we also have to adapt our forms, and we need to revision them and come together and rethink them. So this is a provocation that I think has to be attended, because we cannot increase the field, I think, if we don't really reconsider also how do we include others and the care of others in the process. So I think it's very timely, actually.
Thank you. My last question for the panel before I open up to the audience. Final words, just very quickly, briefly. How do you see a research project of this kind potentially having a significant influence on the world? I'm going to start with James.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, my answer to that is sort of a bit of a follow-on to the previous discussion. When we talk about the ethics of doing this kind of work in an institutional or organizational context, we're really just talking about rules, right? We're talking about what people think they're allowed to do, rather than what they believe they should do as a matter of what is right, what is correct, what is the best behavior for building relationships of the kind that we wish to build. And I do think that kind of ethic is downstream from people's personal realizations and understandings, that you have these experiences and your ethics change as a result of those, not because ultimately they're enforced top down. And also because I don't really believe that process works. If you look at the so-called ethics of AI in the present moment, you have lots of large corporations talking about their ethical arguments around making technology, but that is always subservient to a bottom line, essentially, because ultimately, if those ethics clash with making profits, then it won't be enacted. And the same when it comes to doing certain kinds of research. If you come into certain kind of research and the ethic ultimately clashes with the kinds of knowledges that you are trying to produce, because those knowledges are based on historic forms of power relationship, which is how the scientific method and most of Western science has worked, then those ethics are ultimately going to be subverted or shifted in some way. They have to start really with individual practices. And that's why I think it's really hopeful to see, hopefully, projects like this, which start with individual practitioners, things like the example that Heather gave, providing an example of what this actually means. Most of my favorite scientists, designers, practitioners in other ways, they start from a position of humility, of giving up their power, the power that comes with human exceptionalism, in these relationships, to acknowledge that they are only one participant in these kind of processes. And those inform the results, and they inform the way people talk about it, the way it's discussed, the way it's presented to others. And that matters. I mean, that it literally matters in the way that when I say that it's necessary for one to change in order to change everything else, like our own behavior changes how this works. And so if that is what is an outcome of these kind of programs, that shift in practitioner behavior, then that ultimately is what shifts organizational and societal and cultural norms.
Thank you, James. Delfina, do you want to final words?
Yes, I would like to see the impact in two ways. One is the role that art and design institutions can have and how that can be supported with the right expertise and the right vision. So I think that's one thing, and how this could be spread also in different localities to that very own context of different places. And in terms of the journey of these design practitioners that we're going to follow, we're also really going to understand all their obstacles and pain points. So understanding that will also allow us to see ways in which that can be supported further, and perhaps also going to where your area, Onya, in terms of economy, we also have to shift the way that we think we can support them. We cannot just treat these practitioners, specifically those ones interested in entrepreneurship, as if they were selling anything else and expect that kind of growth. And that's a big problem when you reach seed funding and you attend the incubator or an accelerator. So yeah, we need to find also the right economic system to support this to be in line with regenerative.
Thank you, Tuukka.
Yeah, we already said a few things about the ambitions of B-Regen. But if I say something else just to add to that a little bit, I would say that we hope that this project will add to the confidence of the field. So that's one other contribution, so that more people will feel that they can get involved and they have a sense of the challenges and the possibilities, because it still is a bit of an, somewhat obscure area of practice and research, and perhaps a bit even more ambitiously. If we were able to kind of show and open up this journey into regenerative design and innovation through really sort of real world examples, then perhaps the larger organizations of the world will have fewer excuses to not do it. So we'll be able to come to them, and there'll be various debates around the world that maybe we will participate in, and there will be greenwashing, and there will be excuses, there'll be reasons for why they're not doing regeneration, but we'll be able to say that, look, like there's a good amount of knowledge, there's experience, we can point them to resources in this field as well. So hopefully there'll be fewer excuses to not get involved in regenerative design innovation.
I think there are different ways to answer that. I think there's the potential that you talk about, support ecosystems. The research project in itself can become an ecosystem for the different practitioners that you're working with. Many people who are the innovators in these fields are small, sometimes isolated. They don't have economic power. They don't have a large voice in the sector they're working. So I think that networking and the research project has the potential to amplify those voices, and then through that amplification, like you say, it can feed up to affecting change in the bigger company kind of field. So yeah, kind of scale and thinking about it as an ecosystem itself, I think.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to welcome questions from the audience. Shall we start with the gentleman over there? Thank you.
Hi, this is mainly aimed at James, but welcome comments from others on the panel. So I'm an architect. I'm involved in a master planning project extending a town, and we regularly ask ourselves in design team meetings, what would the LORACs say about this? And I'm wondering how we could go further than that. How might we better engage the more than human species in the decision-making processes?
So it's a lovely thing to think about. Yeah, I also often ask the Lorax. There's the things that I've looked at, and I'm not an architect, or certainly not a master planner. But there seems to be growing ways in which planning is possible in ways that amplifies the life ways of other beings that inhabit these places. So the examples I've looked at are things like wildlife corridors, parks, biodiversity spaces, these kind of things that I think are, as I'm aware, as much as I'm aware, becoming more and more part of these kind of planning processes, that we make space within and around the places in which we live for the thriving of other species. That seems like the basics. There's also a growing approach to thinking about how you do meaningful, more than human decision making. So whether that's computational examples like the entrainment of the slime molds, like Heather was talking about, or whether it's looking at other kind of sense making that more than humans do. I think a lot about a project in Italy where they monitor the behaviors of goats and sheep who are capable of predicting earthquakes far in ahead, both of humans but also of any of our technological apparatus. And so by like listening to the animals in this way, we actually can hear them warn us of dangerous events. And so there's ways in which this can come, and we will, as we think on it, perhaps think more. But also, it's also important to remember that just thinking about how we work with and think with non-humans doesn't necessarily look like the kind of decision-making processes that we're used to. It doesn't necessarily mean getting everyone in a room and sort of getting around a shared dock and thinking about this. It means very simply thinking about how every decision that we make will have the benefits for the most. Because non-humans communicate to us all the time what it is that we do that helps or hinders them. That is their participation. That is them participating in our worlds, telling us what they need and how we can best support them. Most of that knowledge we actually have. What matters is to act on it and to prioritize that as equally with all the other things that we're prioritizing when we're making plans, whether that's building a town or, or designing a product or anything else. Who is affected by this thing? And how much do they matter in our calculuses of what we decide to do? That doesn't always look like a planning application or, a colloquium exactly, but it does mean taking those things into account meaningfully.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions at the back, and then I will take a question. So I'll take one more question in the room and then go to a question from the online community.
Hi, there's been so much interesting talk today about meeting nature and immersing in nature. And my feeling is when you combine that with Ostrom's work on commons management of natural resources, you realize that a lot of interhuman relationships need to kind of be composted or dissolved. And unfortunately, one of those is the designer-consumer relationship. And so as a lecturer at the RCA, that's not a very glamorous proposition for students who've applied here to gain a certain amount of prestige. And the other one being obviously land ownership and how that particular resource is distributed. So I wondered if in your work with meeting nature, you've reached any conclusions about how interhuman relationships need to be reorganized to support that, and how we can pass that on to our students in a way that is inspiring to them.
Who wants to take that question?
I'll quickly say something to it. I've just been speaking, but I will just say that the most fundamental educational experience I've had is through the thing that I briefly mentioned, talking about the Walter Siegel method of building, starting from this belief that really anyone can build a house, learning to do that, and then having the facility to teach that to others, and then having them quickly surpass that experience very quickly. I've done it with students who had not done any building before and who quickly took over and improved things. And you can just sort of walk away at this point. I think of the educational model is fundamentally unsuited to these kind of processes. But I do think but it's also the best model we have for distributing power. I think of David Graeber. I remember he was being interviewed by someone who was sort of quite hostile to his politics. And he said, oh, you anarchists, you don't believe in power, do you, or in authorities? And he's like, well, no, I believe in certain kinds of authorities, but I believe very specifically in the kind of authority that gives itself away, which is the teacher's authority, which someone who knows something is capable of teaching that thing to someone else. And in doing so, they give up their own authority. Like that is like passed on until the teacher is no longer necessary. And that's a very powerful thing, but what actually gets passed on matters. Is it pure knowledge? Is it just information? Is it this kind of knowledge from above? Or is it the ability for someone to take up the tools and construct their own systems as a result of it? That seems to me, massively fundamental and requires quite large restructuring of the way that most teaching, but most living happens today.
Yeah, I'd like to follow on from that in the teaching. Education is an invitation, and as a teacher is really creating the conditions for learning to take place. And I think we need to remember that it's not the transference of knowledge, it's creating the conditions for a learning experience. And we can do really simple things. We can go for a walk rather than sit in studios. We can put a magnifying glass up to our eye and spend 5 minutes contemplating the structural properties of algae. So I think we have the power to shift perspectives, and it's a gradual thing. And it's about people making their own discovery. And so many young people have rejecting the consumptive dominant narrative, and really looking for alternatives. And there does need to be a kind of massive radical shift, because those the kind of neo-capitalist mentality is so ingrained in our thinking, in our habits, in our institutions, in our systems. So it is a challenge, but it's about exposure and finding your own kind of little moments of enlightenment and thinking, okay, there are different narratives that can take place.
Thank you. Oh, Delfina, you want to see?
It's a very great comment. I used to teach in fashion, Louis, and one of the things we spoke and we very much encourage is, not because to enter of such a discipline, specifically going to your question about making products and fashion being such a pollutant industry, creating so many unnecessary products. We believe that designers not only should do products, they can actually now help us rethink systems, they can help us to reconfigure policies. So I think, at least for me, one of the most interesting areas in design now is not so much that product specificity, but of course there's a huge space there to design better with better materials, with better processes, with locality. But it's also how can designers feed into other parts of the infrastructural problems and regenerate from there, not through this consumer object obsession that we've been having for many, many decades. So I think there's a huge potential. There's a very different way of thinking, there's inventive ways. So yeah, I'm a huge believer that designers in the future could intervene in many of the dysfunctionalities in a system level, not by designing products, and definitely not by thinking in this consumerist approach.
Thank you. I will take one more question, and I'd like to go to the online community, please. Thank you, Misha.
Hi, this is a question from anonymous online attendee. So they're curious to know whether regenerative thinking and techniques could be applied also to transform the way we work with non-living materials, and if so, how could that look like?
Is there anyone specifically they'd like to answer the question?
I don't think so, no.
Does anyone want to respond?
That's a great question, because regeneration has a lot of discourse that is about the living systems, and that tends to lead to life, and the environments are composed by biotic and abiotic living, and they're both important fundamentals in an ecosystemic level. So that question is very important. It's not just about working with this incredible variety of our species, but also how do we care about the resources that we're surrounded by? They are an important part of the ecosystem of those millions of different species. So this non-extractive, respectful approach in design has to also permeate to that non-alive element, because it's as important than the alive one.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the panel session. You will have a chance to speak to Heather. So there's a little bit of time to network at the end. Now Heather would like to play the video, the recording of the commemoration, so we get to see what that looked like. And after that, we'll have Jamie perform for us, and then Tuukka will